Have you ever felt lost, as if you were living someone else's life, chasing expectations without knowing who you really are? Michel de Montaigne, one of the greatest thinkers of the Renaissance, left a legacy that can help you solve this. And the truth he reveals is surprisingly simple, but it can change everything. Today, you will discover how to find yourself through the eyes of a philosopher who wrote to understand himself. Topic number 1. Do you know yourself? When we hear the phrase "know thyself," we usually associate it with Greek philosophy, especially Socrates, who repeated it as an essential mantra for wisdom. But Michel de Montaigne, a 16th century French philosopher, took this idea to a much more intimate and courageous level. While many thinkers wrote grand treatises trying to explain the world, Montaigne turned his gaze inward and wrote to try to understand himself. His famous essays are, in fact, a personal journey. They do not have the classic structure of rigid rational arguments, but rather take the form of honest, open, often chaotic conversations about the fears, flaws, joys, and thoughts that accompanied him. He spoke of his physical pains, his emotional crises, his vanity, his insecurities, and even his intestinal problems without any shame. This may seem strange, even irrelevant to some, but that is precisely where the power of his philosophy lies. Montaigne teaches us that knowing oneself is not about creating an idealized image, but rather about facing who we are with sincerity, without filters or makeup. In his view, true self-knowledge does not come from trying to mold oneself to an ideal of virtue or perfection, but from a willingness to observe one's own nature with brutal honesty. He wrote, "The greatest of all undertakings is to know oneself, and this is not a task for the weak. Seeing our contradictions, our masks, our ignorance, and our deepest fears requires quiet courage." And Montaigne had that courage. Instead of hiding behind erudite speeches, he presented himself as he was, human, vulnerable, imperfect. This vulnerability is what makes him so relevant today. In a world where many live trying to appear invincible, Montaigne reminds us that strength lies in truth, and that truth begins within us. If we really want to find who we are, we need to stop pretending, stop repeating what we hear from others, and start looking deeply at what is going on inside. This requires time, silence, reflection. Montaigne did not have today's digital distractions, but he had something equally difficult to face: himself. And he set himself to this task as a craftsman of the soul, carving every thought, every doubt, every sensation into words. He shows us that writing can be a way of thinking, and thinking can be a way of revealing ourselves. Each essay he left behind is like a mirror, and if we look at it closely, we may discover not only who Michel de Montaigne was, but also who we are beneath the layers of expectations, beneath the social masks, beneath the noise of the world. The invitation he extends to us is not complex, but it is profound. Stop. Listen to yourself, accept yourself, and only then begin to truly live. Topic number 2. You are copying yourself without realizing it. Montaigne was one of the first philosophers to realize an uncomfortable truth. Most people live their lives imitating others. They repeat what they hear from their parents, teachers, books, religion, culture, without ever stopping to reflect on whether it makes sense to them. This criticism may seem harsh, but it is incredibly relevant today. How many decisions have you made just because it was the right thing to do? How many opinions do you hold that, if you are honest with yourself, you have never examined in depth? For Montaigne, living by imitating others is losing what is most precious: one's own identity. He said that human beings have a natural tendency to mold themselves to others, to compare themselves, to follow models, and in doing so, they end up distancing themselves from their own essence. Instead of building themselves, they start copying themselves. And worse, they do it without realizing it. We become reflections of a world that pressures us to follow ready-made formulas for happiness, success, virtue, and wisdom. In the Essays, Montaigne writes, "We find it easier to imitate than to invent." And that is a problem. Because when we imitate, we stop listening to our inner voice. We stop experiencing what we really think, feel, and believe. We live like characters on a stage, playing roles that were written by others. School tells you how to learn. Society tells you how to act. The media tells you how to look, and you follow, without questioning. Montaigne saw this as an invisible prison, a life built on external standards rather than conscious choices. He himself broke out of this cycle. He didn't want to write like the classical philosophers. He didn't want to appear wiser than he was. He wanted to be true to himself. And so his texts don't follow a fixed format, don't have a defined thesis, don't seek to convince anyone. They simply explore, with curiosity, humility, authenticity. And that is the great key he gives us. Stop comparing yourself to others. Start observing yourself. Ask yourself, what do I really think about this? Why do I act this way? Is this mine, or was I taught to believe it is? Montaigne's proposal is simple but powerful. Instead of seeking external references all the time, look inward. Become an attentive observer of yourself. Life is not about fitting into molds, but about discovering what makes you unique. And that's only possible when you stop copying and start creating from your own experience. Montaigne didn't want you to be like him. He wanted you to be you. And that is perhaps one of the greatest forms of freedom. The moment you stop copying yourself, you start building yourself, and finally you begin to live a life that has meaning, not because it's perfect, but because it's truly yours. Topic number 3. You are not stable. And that's a good thing. Montaigne had something that most philosophers of his time did not have: the humility to admit that he was fickle. While so many sought to present an image of firmness, consistency, and unshakable stability, he acknowledged, "I do not paint being, I paint passing." By this he meant that human beings are not statues. They are not fixed, predictable, or immutable. We are flux, we are change. Today we think one way, tomorrow another. Feelings fluctuate, certainties crumble. And that's okay. In fact, it's natural. The problem is that society expects us to be artificially constant. It expects us to always have the same opinion, the same stance, the same personality. It expects us to be a consistent personal brand. But Montaigne knew that this was an illusion. He saw human beings as a river, always moving, always changing. What's more, he saw beauty in this. By accepting his own instability, Montaigne invites us to do the same, to stop demanding rigid perfection from ourselves and start embracing the fluidity of the human experience. This does not mean a lack of character or values. It simply means recognizing that we are constantly under construction, that our identity is not a rock, but a narrative made up of pieces, phases, lessons learned, falls, and new beginnings. And this view is liberating. How many times have you blamed yourself for changing your mind, for not feeling the same? Were you used to? For realizing that you're in a different phase of life, with different priorities? Montaigne would say, that's natural. What's more, he would encourage you to welcome this change as a sign of growth, not weakness. In his essays, he contradicts himself several times, and he doesn't try to hide it. On the contrary, he embraces his changes of opinion as part of the process of self-discovery. He understands that the world changes, and that he changes with it, and so do you. This means that today you can defend something with conviction, and tomorrow realize that you were wrong. That doesn't make you a hypocrite, it makes you human. The truth is that being fickle is part of wisdom, not a flaw. The wise are not those who never change. They are those who change consciously without fear of appearing inconsistent, because they are more concerned with being true than with appearing stable. Montaigne teaches us that we don't need to fixate on labels. We don't need to live as prisoners of an old version of ourselves. We can grow, we can evolve, we can contradict ourselves, and still be honest. Because honesty isn't about maintaining a facade, but about humbly recognizing that we are always in transit. So if today you feel that you are changing, that you are no longer the same as before, that certain ideas no longer serve you, don't fight it. Use it. Observe, reflect, accept. Montaigne would say to you, you are not a rock, you are a river, and it's okay to follow your course. The stability we seek is not found in rigidity, but in accepting that change is the only constant. And it is when we stop fighting against this flow that we begin to find peace. Topic number 4. Truth changes when you change. Montaigne shows us something that few have the courage to admit. Truth is not a block of stone that we find ready-made somewhere absolute. It is something that reveals itself as we transform. In other words, truth changes when we change. This sounds uncomfortable, especially in a world that demands certainty, firmness, and unshakable convictions. But Montaigne knew that the search for truth is not a straight line. It is a winding path full of detours, twists, and even contradictions. Because as we grow, we accumulate experiences, suffer losses, change environments, learn new things, our perception changes, and with it, what we considered true also changes. This is not weakness, it is evolution. The truth of who you were 5 years ago does not need to, and perhaps should not, be the same as it is today. And the biggest mistake we can make is to remain stuck in outdated ideas just to appear consistent. Montaigne did not write to teach universal truths. He wrote to understand what he was feeling at that specific moment in his life. And that is why his essays are so human. One day he saw himself as courageous, the next as a coward. One day he extolled wisdom, the next he confessed that he was tired of trying to be virtuous. He did not seek forced consistency, but sincerity from the inside out. He understood that the human mind is a field in constant motion, and that one of the greatest lies of modernity is to think that truth and stability always go hand in hand. Sometimes maintaining a truth out of stubbornness or pride is just a disguised form of stagnation. Real courage lies in allowing your truths to be updated, as if they were internal software being improved as new information arrives. This does not mean falling into empty relativism, where everything is valid. It simply means that truth requires humility. Humility to listen, review, rethink. Montaigne was suspicious of those who spoke with great certainty. He knew that human beings have a dangerous tendency to cling to solid ideas in order to avoid facing the fluidity of life. But according to him, that is exactly what life is, an eternal exercise in adapting between what one feels, what one thinks, and what one discovers. Wisdom does not consist in clinging to an idea, but in knowing how to deal with the 1,000 ideas that cross our minds. This is the living truth, the one that accompanies our growth. So the next time you change your mind, instead of blaming yourself for being inconsistent, stop and think. Maybe you're not contradicting yourself. Maybe you're just closer to yourself. Sometimes the truth we carried was not really ours. It belonged to someone else, from another time, from another version of ourselves. Montaigne invites us to let these truths die when necessary, so that more honest ones can be born. And that is not the end of wisdom. It is its true beginning. Topic number 5. The path inward is the only true path. Montaigne spent much of his life in his castle, not as a misanthropic recluse, but as a man determined to take the most difficult journey of all, the journey inward. At a time when philosophers wrote about morality, virtues, politics, or religion with a tone of authority, Montaigne did something radically different. He wrote about his fears, his doubts, his weaknesses. While the world looked outward, trying to control the external chaos, Montaigne turned his gaze inward, facing his own inner chaos. And that is why he still speaks to us so powerfully centuries later. He understood that all real transformation begins within, not without. That speeches, appearances, masks, and rituals only have value if they are aligned with a soul that knows itself. Otherwise, they are just noise. But this inner journey is not romantic. It is not easy. It takes courage. Because when you look inside, you are confronted with what you usually try to avoid: your resentments, your contradictions, your unresolved traumas, your vanity disguised as virtue. And yet, it is this confrontation that liberates. Montaigne shows us that the only authority that really matters is the one you gain over yourself. Society can give you titles, applaud you, consider you wise. But if you don't know who you are, if you can't be alone with your own thoughts, all of that is just a comfortable illusion. True power, according to him, is becoming your own friend, being able to live in peace with your own conscience, observing yourself honestly without hating yourself, but also without deceiving yourself. In his writings, Montaigne does not try to appear perfect. He shows himself to be all too human. He talks about his crises, his laziness, his hypochondria, his vanity, and precisely because of this, he is deeply true. Because those who know themselves do not need to pretend, he understood that there is nothing more revolutionary than someone who accepts themselves with lucidity. Not passive acceptance, but active acceptance, looking at yourself and saying, "This is where I start." Montaigne did not seek to be an ideal, he sought to be real, and that changes everything, because in the world we live in, where everyone wants to appear to be something, stronger, more confident, more correct, being someone who knows themselves and accepts themselves as they are becomes an act of silent resistance. The great lesson he leaves us is this: don't run outside looking for answers. The real journey begins when you have the courage to sit down with yourself and ask, sincerely, who am I really when no one is looking? That question may not have an immediate answer. It may hurt, it may tear you apart, but it is also the question that starts the most authentic process of reconstruction there is, because once you start to know yourself, you stop living through the eyes of others, and you finally begin to live for your own essence. For Montaigne, this was the only path worth taking. And perhaps deep down it still is today. In the end, Montaigne teaches us something simple, but which few apply. Living well is not about having certainties, but about cultivating presence and curiosity about yourself. Instead of looking for ready-made formulas, he invites us to observe, feel, and think more freely. The great revolution he proposes requires no shouting or external battles, just a more sincere look inward. Because when you learn to inhabit your own mind with honesty, the world outside no longer controls you as easily. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough freedom to change everything.